April 1945 settled over the American transit camp like a cold breath from a collapsing world. And the morning began with the clatter of metal trays, the scrape of boots on gravel, and the low hum of a war running out of time. Behind the barbed wire fences, a cluster of German generals' men, who once commanded armies with certainty, formed an uneven line, their greatcoats hanging loose on bodies thinned by months of retreat and rationing. They carried themselves with dignity, but it was the kind born of habit, not confidence, a thin veil stretched over exhaustion. Each man understood that the world he had served was crumbling faster than anyone dared admit. At the front stood General Hartmann, his spine rigid from decades of discipline. He stared at the pink slices of meat dropped onto his tray and muttered, loud enough for the officers behind him to hear, "Das ist Schweinesfraß, pig slop." His voice carried a mix of contempt and wounded pride. The voice of a man who once inspected silver cutlery in officers' messes, and now found himself staring at canned meat served on a dented plate that an American cook barely reacted. He slid another slice of Spam onto the pan, the fat sizzling with a sharp hiss. The smell drifted across the yard, salty, warm, unexpectedly inviting. Several Germans tried not to inhale too deeply. Hunger was a traitor, and even generals struggled to silence it. They moved toward a wooden bench and sat with deliberate slowness, as though posture might mask discomfort. The wind swept across the yard, carrying faint sound, soldiers laughing, trucks coughing to life, prisoners murmuring. The generals stared at their trays. Each face revealed a different version of disbelief or concealed longing. Only weeks earlier, some still believed in miracle counterattacks and rumors of phantom divisions. Now they sat in captivity, confronted by a meal they had been conditioned to despise. A young American private approached, barely old enough to shave. He glanced at the untouched trays and offered a mild smile. "My mom fries it the same way," he said casually. There was no mockery, just an easy sincerity that unsettled the officers more than an insult would have. Before any could respond, he walked on, humming a faint tune. Hartmann grunted. "Even their boys eat this," he said, though it sounded more like bewilderment than disdain. His fingers twitched toward his fork before he pulled them back. Colonel Weber, seated beside him, stared hard at the meal. His thoughts drifted to the final days before capture-thin soup, coarse bread, the hollow ache that never faded. Compared to those weeks, even this unfamiliar American dish carried a quiet promise. Still, no one ate. Pride held their hands still. Across the yard, two American guards chatted about baseball, glancing occasionally at the line of stiff-backed prisoners. Their relaxed posture highlighted the imbalance between captor and captive, between a nation flush with supplies and an enemy whose war machine had collapsed. The contrast was unmistakable. Minutes passed. The steam rising from the Spam thinned. The potatoes cooled. Hunger pressed harder now, sharpening their senses. Hartmann's stomach tightened painfully, and he shifted to disguise it. He had survived battles and freezing marshes. Yet here he was, fighting an absurd duel with a meal he refused to acknowledge. Weber leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It cannot be as terrible as we were told." The officer across from him muttered, "It is American." That is enough. The weak laughter that followed lacked conviction. Their old jokes felt out of place in a world where their authority had vanished. Hartmann's hand drifted toward the fork again, hovering before retreating. The Americans had taken their freedom, their rank, their certainty. Must he surrender even this small act of defiance? But he knew the question was hollow. Defiance did not fill an empty stomach, nor did it restore a shattered nation. A gust of wind swept dust across the yard, carrying another wave of sizzling from the cook's pan. This batch was louder, richer in smell, almost mocking in its appeal. Weber's stomach growled audibly, and several officers looked away in embarrassment. Hartmann felt the tremor of hunger run through him. He studied the tray again. The Spam glistened faintly in the morning light, no longer steaming, but still holding its shape. The potatoes stiffened at the edges. Something inside him shifted, not surrender, but a recognition that the war had stripped away the luxuries of ego. Food was food, and hunger was an enemy no one outranked. Silence settled over the group. In the stillness, memories flickered through Hartman's mind: banquets in Warsaw, strategy meetings in Paris, evenings when officers toasted victories they believed would last a century. Those days felt impossibly distant now, like scenes from another lifetime. Hunger blurred the edges of pride, and the cold morning air pressed against him with a kind of indifferent honesty, reminding him that survival had always been more fragile than leaders dared admit. Even the Americans seemed to sense the tension. Glancing toward the bench where the proudest prisoners in the camp sat frozen before their meal, Hartman lifted the fork. Slowly, as though raising a flag he no longer believed in. The metal trembled in his grip. He held it above the spam, suspended between pride and need. The yard felt suddenly still, the moment stretching like a held breath. Tense and waiting for resolution. Then the fork descended, just enough to pierce the edge of the slice. No one spoke quietly. The generals watched, unable to hide anticipation or dread. The Americans nearby glanced over, curious. Even Weber leaned forward, eyes narrowed, as if witnessing something larger than a man deciding to eat. Hartman hesitated. The small piece of spam balanced on the fork, hovering inches from his mouth, and as he drew in one steady breath, tasting only faint salt on the air, he realized the moment was no longer about a meal. It was the first crack in a wall built from years of certainty, authority, and illusion, a wall about to crumble with the first bite. The fork trembled in Hartman's hand, but the bite never reached his mouth. A shout from the gate carried across the yard, breaking the fragile moment. A truck rumbled in, its tires grinding over gravel as American guards waved prisoners aside. The distraction let the general lower his fork without committing to the decision. Yet the tension lingered like a taste he hadn't taken. Weber exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath along with his superior. The others tried to mask their disappointment or relief, but the hesitation revealed how deeply the act mattered. It wasn't about food anymore. It was about the slow erosion of their last intact illusion. The truck halted near the kitchen, and crates were unloaded: white sacks marked flour, tins labeled corn syrup, even a few boxes of powdered eggs. The abundance was unmistakable. The Germans watched with a mixture of envy and disbelief, seeing in those supplies the industrial might their leaders once dismissed as soft and decadent. Weber murmured, "So much." Even now, Hartman didn't answer. He was staring at the crates with a growing understanding that everything they had been taught about American weakness had been a mirage. The Americans worked casually, joking as they stacked provisions. One guard tossed an empty spam tin into a bin with perfect aim, eliciting laughter from his partner. Their ease carried its own kind of power. It reminded the Germans that the men feeding them were not stretched thin, not desperate, not haunted by shortages. These were soldiers who could afford to joke. Soldiers supplied by a nation that had outproduced the world. Weber finally lifted his fork, not to eat, but to gesture subtly. "They fight a different war than we imagined," he said. Hartman's expression darkened, as if acknowledging the truth was itself a defeat. He had commanded thousands, survived encirclements, watched divisions dissolve into scattered bands. Yet the sight of a truck full of food left him more shaken than battlefield chaos. It spoke of a strength impossible to counter with strategy or valor. A few benches away, a pair of younger German officers whispered bitterly. One blamed the high command for their predicament. Another insisted the Americans would soon show cruelty. But their voices lacked conviction. Even the most loyal officers couldn't ignore what their senses told them. The enemy had more. More supplies, more stability, more margin for humanity. In the shadow of those crates, German propaganda sounded like a distant fairy tale. Hartman looked at his tray again. The spam had cooled to a dull pink, its sheen fading, the potatoes stiffening. His appetite remained a silent ache, growing heavier as pride tried to smother it. But pride was beginning to feel as brittle as the crust on the cooling meat. He didn't pick up the fork. Still, something changed in the way he looked at the food, not with open acceptance, but with reluctant recognition. A thin officer named Klaus, who had remained silent through most of the morning, finally spoke. "Do you remember Breslau?" His voice quivered with memory. We ate bread made with sawdust. His eyes moved to the Spam, and the contrast was too sharp for any of them to ignore. Klaus had lost weight rapidly in those final weeks. His cheeks were hollow, his hands unsteady. His quiet statement stirred something uncomfortable among the group. Shared recollection of hunger so deep it blurred into pain. Even Hartman couldn't dismiss it. He had ordered men to hold positions long after supplies ran dry. He knew hunger. He knew desperation. Now, in this camp, the Americans offered food unfamiliar, mocked, but undeniably sustaining. The irony stung more than the cold wind. As if sensing the tension, an American sergeant approached. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with a calm demeanor that suggested he'd seen enough war not to fear proud prisoners. "You gentlemen need anything?" he asked in a tone that wasn't friendly, but wasn't hostile either. The question hung in the air, absurd in its generosity. Hartman felt his jaw tighten. Klaus nearly nodded before stopping himself. Weber simply said, "No." The sergeant shrugged and walked on, leaving behind a silence filled with complicated emotions. The generals exchanged glances. The sergeant's casual courtesy was harder to endure than any insult would have been. It forced them to confront the truth they'd resisted. The enemy treated them with more restraint than many had expected, perhaps more than they believed they deserved. It suggested a different moral landscape than the one painted by propaganda. Back home, a loud clatter drew their attention as a crate of potatoes was accidentally dropped. The American cooks laughed, one shaking his head in mock frustration. The moment was ordinary, almost domestic, and it underscored how unnatural the general's stiff refusal looked in comparison. Hunger, cold, humiliation, these weighed on them. Yet across the yard, life continued with a rhythm they could not join. Weber looked at Hartman again. "We can't endure long like this," he said softly. He did not mean the war. He meant the gnawing emptiness beneath their ribs. Klaus shifted closer, his expression pleading without words. Even those who had mocked the food earlier now stared at it with thinly veiled longing. Hartman felt the weight of their eyes. Leadership meant upholding the dignity of the group, yet those men deserved more than symbolic resistance. The sky thickened with overcast gray, promising a colder afternoon. A distant train horn echoed from beyond the camp, fading into the hum of activity. The generals huddled a little tighter on the bench, conserving warmth. Weber's hands shook slightly. Whether from cold or hunger, it was impossible to tell. Minutes stretched, each one thinning the line between pride and surrender. Hartman's gaze drifted again to the tray, to the simple meal that held no malice except the challenge it represented. He felt himself weakening, not in body but in certainty. What was the purpose of refusing food when no one watched, no one judged, no principle truly stood to be defended? The war was over for them. Survival, not symbolism, was now the only battlefield. A single thought crossed his mind, sharp and unwelcome. Perhaps the Americans had known this moment would come. Perhaps the meal itself was a quiet test of how long pride could endure. The idea unsettled him, more than he admitted, and as another gust of wind brushed the yard, carrying the lingering scent of freshly fried meat, Hartman sensed that the next decision he made would mark a line no general could uncross, not one drawn by armies, but by hunger itself. The afternoon settled into a deeper chill, the kind that seeped past uniforms and into bone, and hunger sharpened into something almost physical, a pressure behind the ribs, a hollowing that no posture could disguise. Hartman sat rigidly on the bench, his tray before him like a silent challenger. Around him, the other generals grew quieter, their earlier pride thinning under the weight of need. No one wanted to be the first to break, yet every man felt the same unmistakable pull, the body reminding them of its limits. The American cooks returned to their stoves, frying another batch of Spam with a crackle that sliced through the camp's monotony. The scent drifted toward the bench, richer and more enticing than before, a warm signal in an otherwise cold world. Weber swallowed hard, pretending to shift for comfort, but the motion did nothing to hide the tremor passing through him. Klaus clenched his hands together, as if that single act could silence his stomach's protest. The war had stripped them of many things: authority, illusions, the certainty of victory, But hunger was the one enemy they tried hardest to ignore. Now it pressed in on all sides. A pair of American guards paused near the bench, carrying their own trays. Their portions were generous, steaming, served with a casualness that made the German officer's restraint look almost theatrical. One guard took a large bite, chewed thoughtfully, and said, "Not bad today." The other nodded, grinning. They didn't glance at the prisoners. Their moment was their own, but its contrast was impossible to miss. The generals saw men who ate without hesitation, who lived without fear of scarcity, who didn't question the familiarity of their meals. It was a reminder of everything the Germans had lost, everything they never truly understood about the nation they had tried to defeat. Weber finally broke the silence. "If we were still at the front," he whispered, "this would be a feast." He didn't mean it as praise, but truth has a way of cutting deeper than compliments. Klaus nodded slowly, his expression tightening. In the final months of the war, their meals had dwindled into survival rations. Thin soups, ersatz bread, scraped together portions that barely qualified as food. The memory cast the Spam in an uncomfortably different light. What they had mocked as pig slop was, in reality, more substance than they'd tasted in weeks. Hartman heard the shift in their tone. He recognized it as the first fracture in the barrier they'd built around their pride. Leadership demanded that he remain the last to bend. Yet he felt an unwelcome truth rising within him. His refusal no longer inspired the men, it isolated them. They weren't standing on principle. They were starving on symbolism. And the symbolism was starting to feel as cold as the air around them. Across the yard, an American lieutenant appeared with a clipboard, discussing supply counts with the cooks. Their conversation floated toward the Germans. The camp would receive more meat shipments by morning, flour by evening, and possibly even oranges by the end of the week. Oranges. The word struck Hartman with unexpected force. He had not tasted one since early in the war. The idea that prisoners might receive them before civilians back home felt impossible. Yet nothing in this camp followed the logic they once believed in. When the Americans left, Klaus leaned forward, unable to restrain the quiet desperation in his voice. "General, we must eat." The others didn't speak, but their silence echoed the same plea. Hartman saw the strain in their faces, men who once commanded divisions now reduced to waiting for his signal to take a bite. He didn't blame them. Hunger blurred lines of rank. But he felt the weight of their expectation settle like a stone in his chest. He looked again at the Spam. Its edges had cooled, but the texture remained firm, the scent faint but present. This was not humiliation. It was nourishment. And yet, to accept it felt like admitting something larger, that the Americans they had scorned possessed a strength Germany had never matched. A strength built not only of steel and factories, but of abundant, consistent food, an invisible weapon that had fueled soldiers, civilians, and prisoners alike. Weber placed his fork beside his tray, his hands trembling slightly. "Sir," he murmured, "if you do not eat soon, we will. And we wish to." There was no rebellion in his tone, only honesty, and a quiet readiness to cross whatever line remained. Klaus stared at the general with pleading eyes. Another officer shifted closer, barely containing a shiver. The decision no longer belonged solely to Hartman. It had become a collective need. He realized, with a slow exhale, that his role was not to preserve pride, but to preserve these men. They had followed him through fire, through mud, through hopeless retreats. If he kept them from eating now, it would not be leadership, it would be cruelty. The moment stretched, heavy and brittle. Then, with a single steady motion, Hartman lifted his fork. He didn't raise it slowly this time. He didn't overthink it. The piece of Spam rose to his mouth, and for the first time that day, no one looked away. He tasted it, the salt, the faint smokiness, the unremarkable yet comforting flavor that spread across his tongue like a reluctant truth. He closed his eyes briefly, not in pleasure, but in acknowledgement. "It is not slop," he said quietly. The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Weber's breath escaped in something between relief and disbelief. Klaus immediately reached for his fork. The others followed, each man moving with an urgency contained only by discipline. The first bites were cautious, almost ceremonial. Then the mood shifted slightly at first, then unmistakably, as hunger surged faster than dignity could restrain it. They ate, not ravenously, but with the steady, deliberate hunger of men reclaiming a basic human right. For a brief moment, warmth returned to the bench, not physical warmth, but a sense of grounding. The war, their failure, the collapse of everything they'd once known, all of it remained, yet something soft within them. They were still prisoners, still defeated, but no longer clinging to illusions about the world outside the fence. As the meal ended, Hartman laid his fork down and stared at the half-empty tray. A quiet clarity settled over him. This moment, the tasting, the surrender, the acknowledgement, had cracked something deeper than pride. It had opened a door to a truth none of them had wanted to face. And as he looked at the other generals, still eating with gratitude they tried to hide, he realized that the bite he had taken was not just his own. It was the first step toward accepting a reality far more difficult to swallow than spam. The enemy's strength had never been arrogance or brutality, but something far simpler and far more undeniable. They had been defeated by a nation that could feed its soldiers, feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its own sons. The realization lingered like a quiet echo, and in that fragile silence, a new question began forming, one far heavier than hunger. What else had they been wrong about? In the fading light of the next morning, the camp felt strangely calmer, as if the act of eating had loosened some invisible knot inside the prisoners. Hartman woke earlier than usual, his body no longer fighting the same relentless ache of hunger. The memory of the previous day lingered with a quiet weight, less shame than recognition. Around him, the other officers stirred, their movements slower but steadier, each man aware that something subtle had shifted among them. They were still captives, still defeated, yet something about the simple acceptance of food had brought an unexpected clarity. It reminded them that survival was not merely endurance. It was the ability to see truth where illusion once stood. The Americans moved through the yard with their usual purposeful rhythm. A cook unloaded more crates near the kitchen, humming a tune that drifted across the cold air. Weber watched him, studying the ease in his posture. "They live as if the war never reached them," he murmured. Klaus, tightening his coat, replied, "Perhaps it never truly did." The statement hung between them, not as criticism, but as a realization of a truth they had long denied. America's distance, its vast resources, had insulated it from the hunger and ruin that had hollowed Europe. The officers exchanged glances, each quietly recalibrating the world in their minds. As breakfast was served, oatmeal, bread, a thin smear of butter, the officers accepted their trays without hesitation. No one commented on the food. No one muttered insults. The quiet was not discomfort now, but reflection. Hartman tasted the oatmeal, warm and plain, and allowed himself a small breath. It wasn't luxury, but it was honest sustenance. For the first time since capture, he felt the fog in his mind begin to lift. Around the bench, murmured conversations grew. Some officers spoke of their families, uncertain whether letters would ever reach them. In truth, that simple gesture struck deeper than any lecture could have. It reminded them that beyond uniforms and borders, people everywhere recognized hunger, understood longing, and wished for comfort. After their walk, the generals returned to the bench and sat together. The sun climbed higher, thinning the morning chill. Hartman looked at the men around him, Weber with his thoughtful gaze, Klaus with his fragile earnestness. The others, each carrying burdens heavier than their coats. He realized that yesterday's moment, the tasting of spam, had not been a humiliation. It had been a beginning, a small necessary break in the walls they had built around themselves. Weber leaned closer. "Do you think they intend to keep feeding us this well?" Hartman answered quietly, "Yes, because they can." Weber nodded, his eyes narrowing with contemplation. "And because they choose to." That distinction pierced through them. Power was one thing. The will to use it with restraint was another entirely. The war had ended differently than they expected, not because Germany lacked bravery, but because it lacked the abundance that allowed a nation to wage war without starving its people. When lunch arrived, stew, bread, a slice of canned fruit, the officers, ate with steady hands. Conversations turned sober. They discussed tactics, leadership failures, the chasm between ideology and reality. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that their understanding of the world had been shaped by half-truths and selective stories. Captivity forced them to see what loyalty had once concealed. Others recounted the chaos of their final days, in uniform bridges destroyed, supply lines severed, men forced to scavenge for anything edible. The contrast with the camp's steady meals was impossible to ignore. Klaus broke a piece of bread and said softly, "If our supply lines had looked like this, perhaps the war would have ended differently." No one argued. Even Hartman felt the uncomfortable truth settle in his chest. Across the yard, an American lieutenant approached with a clipboard, calling names for work details. The selections were fair, rotating, not punitive. Hartman observed how the prisoners responded, not with rebellion, but with weary acceptance. The resistance that once filled their posture had thinned. They understood now that in this fenced world, survival depended not on defiance, but on adaptation. And adaptation began with acknowledging that the enemy had not been the caricature they once believed. Later, as the officers gathered near the fence for a supervised walk, they saw another supply truck arrive. This one carried boxes marked with oranges, their bright skins visible when the crates were opened. The sight startled them. After years of scarcity, the vibrant color felt almost foreign. An American guard noticed their stares and said lightly, "Might get some in your rations tomorrow." Weber blinked, momentarily unable to respond. Hartman felt a quiet disbelief settle in his chest. The idea that prisoners might taste fruit before children in Germany was almost too much to process. Klaus spoke first. "Our children at home have not seen oranges in years." His voice cracked at the edges. The guard didn't mock him, only nodded with a sympathetic shrug, as though acknowledging a shared hue. As the day faded, the sky flushed with muted colors, Hartman walked to the fence alone. Beyond it, American trucks rumbled on, carrying new supplies, fueling a machine that seemed inexhaustible. He gripped the cold wire and let the weight of the moment settle. The war was over. But a different confrontation had begun, one within themselves. He no longer felt anger, only a heavy clarity. They had underestimated a nation whose strength was measured not only in battles won, but in the simple, consistent act of keeping its people fed. He turned from the fence and saw Weber approaching. The colonel's voice was steady when he said, "General, if the Americans treat their prisoners this well, how do they treat their own?" Hartman didn't answer. He didn't need to. The question itself was the revelation.